if you have people to baptize at Easter, you can use the lectionary year A readings if permission from the bishop is granted. And Bishop White was super excited to grant us permission for that. So we are reading year A readings, which is why we're hearing these beautiful, awesome readings from John. Why? All of the readings for Lent and year A have something to do with baptism. And so they're teaching us and teaching the catechumens about baptism. During Eastertide, year A readings are about the Eucharist. So you kind of see the two great sacraments of baptism and Eucharist as the church is kind of teaching us during these great 90 days of Lent and Eastertide together. The cool part about all of this stuff with the catechumenates and the program and the readings are it also answers the question of Lent that we keep talking about. It answers that phrase from Jesus to come and see. And Lent shows us all kinds of things that the Lord is doing to us right now. We saw him on the first Sunday of Lent go to battle in the desert with the evil one. On the second Sunday of Lent, we begin to hear about baptism when he meets with Nicodemus. And Nicodemus asks him about being born again. And Jesus says, to be born again, you must be born again of water and the Holy Spirit. Last week, we met him with the Samaritan woman at the well, if you remember, right? And that beautiful, it's one of my favorite gospel passages, that beautiful, rich text from John is Jesus is sitting there at the well telling her that he will give living water. Do you remember that from last week, living water? And we talked about what living water is in the first century mindset. Living water, first of all, was just running water. Not water that's in a puddle or in a stagnant water where there's probably disease and all kinds of stuff, but springs and rivers and oceans. Those were living water. They were churning. They were moving, so there wasn't any disease or sickness in them. They were considered living water. But even on a deeper level, living water cleansed us from sin. In the first century world, you went to a thing of living water and immersed yourself where you were cleansed and then were able to come into the temple to pray and worship. It was also purifying. Living water purified. We also heard about living water was something that the bride would bathe herself in before her wedding. And so the word living water also is attached to wedding and covenant language. So running water that purifies and enters us into a marriage covenant. Jesus is the living water, right? That's what we learned last week. Jesus himself is the living water that he wants to give to us. And this week, that's all background for this week. Because we have this another thick and awesome passage from John about Jesus healing a blind man and telling him to go wash in the Pool of Siloam. What is that? You know, I always say, you can't be a good Christian unless you're a good first century Jew. You have to understand the context. And so John writes a word where Jesus says, go wash in the Pool of Siloam. And we're all like, we don't know where that is, but that's kind of cool. But in the first century mind, it's layered with all kinds of history. The Pool of Siloam was a large pool. It's about 25 feet by 25 feet, kind of a trapezoid, more so than a rectangle, that was just south of the temple. The temple was on top of a hill. This is kind of at the bottom of a hill. It was made about 700 years before Jesus was even born by King Hezekiah. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. They were trying to cut them off from the water supply. They got water from a spring of Gidon, which was on the kind of north side of Jerusalem. And so Hezekiah built a tunnel under Jerusalem so that water would go and it would fill into this pool that he built called the Pool of Siloam. It gave them fresh water in the city, and it was also called a place of living water. The Pool of Siloam was a place of living water. About 100 years before Jesus was born, it actually was renovated, and it was huge. Most of Jerusalem got their water from the Pool of Siloam. The priests in the temple, before they would go into the temple, would have their mikvah baths. They would be cleansed of their sin. Guess where? The Pool of Siloam. And then they would go up into the temple to pray. By the time you get to Jesus, the Feast of Tabernacles became really huge. It's called Sukkot in Hebrew. We kind of say it in English, the Feast of Booths. I always think of a telephone booth every time I hear that, and that's not what it really was. The Feast of Tabernacles is one of the three great fall feasts. Our Jewish brothers and sisters across the street celebrate it with great joy. It's a joyous feast. It starts out with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and then we have Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, and then all of those fall feasts end with the Feast of Tabernacles. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles because the Jewish people rely on the providence of God and remember how God fed them and lived with them and dwelt with them as they journeyed out of slavery in Egypt into the Promised Land in those 40 years in the wilderness. And so even to this day, they would build little tabernacles. Each Jewish family, normally on top of their homes at the time of Jesus, would make a little kind of structure, and they would cover it with, guess what? Palm leaves. So this is going to have something to do with this in 2 weeks. They would cover it with palm leaves. They would eat outside to be reminded of how they all dwelt and journeyed, and God lived with them. Still to this day. Rabbi Benji makes a great Sukkot booth, by the way. If you ever go look on his Facebook page, it's pretty cool with his family. That feast went 7, 8 days, somewhere in that length. It was a long day. It was a long feast. And there was a ritual that happened all the time, and especially on the last day of the feast. The city was filled with joy, and there would be a procession from the temple with the high priest and all the priests, and they would come down this narrow road to, guess where? The Pool of Siloam. And when the high priest would get to the Pool of Siloam, he would get a pitcher, and it was pretty big. They say it was the size of 3 logs, so it was deep and big. And he would take water from the Pool of Siloam, and they would take that water, and then they would rejoice into the temple. And the priests would lead the procession. The high priest was at the end, waving palm branches. Sound familiar? And then they would get to the temple, and when they got to the temple, they would begin circling the altar of sacrifice with their palm branches, shouting, Hosanna. And they began to beat the altar as they passed with the palm branches. And they would say that if many leaves came off that stem, the more that their sins were forgiven, as they circled the altar, shouting out Hosanna. And at the end of that, the high priest would come up to the altar with the water, and they would also give him a pitcher of wine with the same amount. And he would pour them on the altar, and it would run out of the altar, out of the temple. Some of the early rabbinic stuff said there was so much of it that it would actually just spill out of the temple into the streets. It was this huge, joyous time of water. This began the spring planting season. They were praying for rain, much like Sean will be doing here in a couple months with the garden outside. And so this was kind of a way to think of God's providence and how that water gave them life. All right, what am I talking about all this for? That's the context of today's gospel. The healing of the blind man takes place right at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. When you read John, this comes from John chapter 9. This whole kind of thing begins at John 7, where they say the Feast of the Tabernacles begins. And on that last day of the feast where the water is running out of the temple is when Jesus says, out of him will spring living water. I will give living water. He points to himself as the water that flows from the temple that gives life. And it's on that next day that this event occurs. You can't understand the totality of today's gospel unless you understand that whole background. So there on the steps after this huge feast, and by the way, the place was packed. The fall pilgrimage festivals, everyone came to Jerusalem. There was probably close to 1 million people there. And here is a man who was pretty much ostracized by society. People who were born blind at that time had no way of earning any sustenance because they were blind, and all they could do was beg for help. He couldn't see anyone. He couldn't do any work for himself, which is why he's at the threshold of the temple. Because why? That's the busiest place in Jerusalem where he can ask for help. And in the middle of trying to figure out how to live and what to do, there's a hustle and bustle. And all of a sudden he hears a man say, "Would you like to see?" What are you smoking? I've been blind from birth. He doesn't know what's going on. He knows we're at the end of this festival. He's hoping just to be able to find bread. And then all of a sudden, he feels this guy put mud on his face. and rub it into his eyes. Go wash in the Pool of Siloam. He would have to go down that street to the pool that, by the way, wasn't empty. There were people packing that road. There were markets on that section. By the way, this all was just discovered about 2 years ago. That Century Street has just now been uncovered. They're going to start letting people actually go see it. You can actually walk that street, which was the main thoroughfare from the Pool of Siloam up to the temple. A Greek Orthodox church was putting a parking lot in, and when they start digging down, oh, look, it's the Pool of Siloam, 2023. And so they're doing the excavations now, and they'll actually clear it, and they want to fill it with water again from the spring of Gihon, which is kind of pretty awesome. But to go down to that path was literally, he would have, remember, he is blind, he has dirt on his face, and he's being jostled by people. And then he gets to the water, and he washes and can see. And he doesn't run away. He runs back to the temple, praising the Lord. And as not only did he have problems getting down there with the hustle and bustle of the marketplace, but then he gets there and he's got to fight with the religious leaders. By the way, that is so humorous in this gospel. I was chuckling up a storm up there. Because when you actually hear that, I mean, he kind of gives it to the Pharisees if you read it, right? They're like, who made you see? I don't know, that guy did. You're one of his disciples. Look, I'm just seeing. He didn't make you see, and I love that. This is something that's really astonishing. You're all the religious leaders, and you have no idea what's going on, but I do. And then Jesus comes to him. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Show me who he is, and I will believe. You are speaking to him. And I love it. He worships him. He recognizes him. What's this all have to do with us? Notice how Jesus begins this story. Do you want to see? Yes. And he spits. Jesus spits into the ground and makes a salve. He makes a salve. I love the interpretation of St. Augustine. He said the spitting in the ground is the very living water of Jesus. It's his divinity that now mixes with the dirt of our humanity. Do you remember on Ash Wednesday we talked about, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We are made from this dirt. God is once again using the material world that he created to reveal himself to us. He's now using that material world to recreate us. He spits in the dirt. He gives that very living water that he talked about to the Samaritan woman. His very own self, he spits into the dirt and makes a salve. The Latin word salvus is where we get salve from, which means health. If you ever watch any old movies, you'll see Roman soldiers or whatever say salve. Salve as they say hello to people. Even in today's modern Italian, salve is hi. It comes from that word meaning good health to you. Good health to you. Jesus became our Salvador, our Savior, the healer, the one who recreates us. And the work of recreation through material things, he then sends him to the Pool of Siloam to wash. Jesus is still using material things to bring about his grace to us in the sacraments. Through water, through bread, through wine, through oil, through material things, Christ is still at work among us. My brothers and sisters, we are all the blind man. We have all been brought to the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam is right here. It's still open. It's the waters of baptism. It's where we are called to be washed and to be healed. And then to go back up into the temple and recognize our God and worship him in the most holy Eucharist. And then to go out into the world and proclaim that love that has transformed us. Yes, this is true anamnesis. You know, we talk about that word a lot, of remembrance. It's not just thinking about the history of the things. We're not just thinking about the story of the blind man. We are spiritually ourselves catapulted to that event as it were happening now. The Pool of Siloam is open to you now. For those who have been baptized, you have already been washed into it. Those who are going to be baptized, you will be washed in it at the Easter Vigil. Today, when you come up to receive communion, place your hands in the Pool of Siloam, in the waters of baptism. Be reminded that Christ is starting the new creation in you in those same waters. Have your hands wet when you come up to receive him in Holy Communion. And just like the blind man who got down on his knees and worshiped him, you will do the same as you receive him in the most blessed sacrament. Those aren't past events. They are happening now to us. That's Lent. It's not just giving up chocolate and beer and biting your fingernails. It's about being recreated. It's allowing Christ to let his living water flow in you so that you can proclaim to the world the good news of salvation. And it's not going to be easy because those Pharisees tried to shut him up. The world will try to shut you up. Don't talk about Jesus. You don't want to be one of those holy rollers. I'm not talking about those who paint the walls in the church. You don't want to be one of those Christian nutcases. Just pipe it down. Why do you want to worship him? And if you notice, that man never lied. And he never went against the truth. And he kept pushing forward. And literally Christ was revealed to him as the Messiah. Place your hands in the waters of Siloam. Kneel at the Lord's feet. Let him heal whatever in your life needs healed today, or whatever is blinded, that our selfishness has blinded you from seeing love at work in the world, and then go proclaim that love to the nations. But first be cleansed in the Pool of Siloam.